A thick, rolling fog settles over London, swallowing the gas lamps whole and turning the cobbled streets into a labyrinth of shadows. It's the kind of night where whispers carry further than footsteps, where the line between the living and the dead feels unnervingly thin. And in the heart of this gloom, Sherlock Holmes, the world's greatest detective, a man who prides himself on logic and reason, finds himself staring into the face of something he cannot explain. This is the story of the man who spoke to ghosts, a case so shrouded in mystery that even Holmes himself questioned the boundaries of the impossible. Picture this: a trembling client sits across from Holmes in 2221B Baker Street. Their voice barely above a whisper as they recount encounters with a presence that shouldn't exist. Footsteps in empty rooms, voices with no source, messages from beyond the grave. At first, Holmes dismisses it as mere trickery, the work of a clever charlatan. But as the evidence mounts a child's toy moving on its own, a letter written in a hand long since cold, even his unshakable mind begins to waver. What if the supernatural isn't just superstition? What if, for once, the dead truly are trying to speak? This is no ordinary mystery. It's a descent into the unknown, a collision of science and the spectral that will challenge everything you think you know about Sherlock Holmes. Over the course of this investigation, we'll follow him through forgotten graveyards and opulent séances, unraveling a web of deceit that stretches far beyond the grave. But be warned, some secrets are buried for a reason. By the end, you may find yourself questioning what lies in the darkness, and whether some doors, once opened, should ever be closed again. So lean in closer, the fog is thickening, and the dead, it seems, have much to say. The first documented brush Sherlock Holmes ever had with the unexplained came not from a shadowy alleyway or a cursed artifact, but from a seemingly ordinary solicitor named Reginald Adair. The man arrived at Baker Street on a damp October evening, his face ashen, his hands clutching a leather satchel like a lifeline. His story was one that would unsettle even the most hardened skeptic. For the past 3 weeks, he claimed, his townhouse in Kensington had been plagued by something beyond reason. A voice, low and insistent, calling his name from empty rooms, footsteps pacing the halls long after the servants had retired. Adair was no fool, no hysterical believer in ghost stories. He'd dismissed the incidents as drafts or overwork, until the night he watched his late wife's favorite teacup slide across the table untouched, stopping just before the edge as if placed there by an invisible hand. That alone might have been dismissed as a trick of the light, but then came the message, scratched into the frost of his bedroom window one morning, clear as day. Find the letters. Holmes, of course, met the tale with his usual razor-sharp skepticism. The idea of spirits communicating through teacups and window panes was absurd on its face, more likely the work of a hidden adversary or an elaborate hoax. Yet something about Adair's account gnawed at him. The man wasn't seeking fame or profit, he was terrified. And so, with that trademark glint of curiosity in his eye, Holmes agreed to visit the house that very night. What awaited them there defied even his keenest deductions. The air in Adair's study was still, the door locked from the inside, yet the moment Holmes stepped inside, the fireplace roared to life without a single ember burning. A book flew from the shelf, landing open to a page circled in ink, a passage about unconfessed sins, and then, just as they turned to leave, the voice. Not a whisper, not a trick of the wind, but a woman's voice, clear as crystal, uttering a single word: justice. That night marked a turning point for the great detective. He'd spent a lifetime dismantling the illusions of frauds and criminals, but this was different. There were no hidden strings, no accomplices lurking in the walls. Only the impossible unfolding before his eyes. And as any true seeker of truth knows, the impossible is merely a puzzle waiting to be solved. The whispers began in the dead of night, a sound so faint the witnesses first mistook it for the wind through the cracks of an old church. But when 7 separate parishioners swore, they heard the same rasping voice murmur the name Jonathan Fairgrave. All within the same hour, even the local constabulary grew uneasy. Their discomfort turned to outright dread when the undertaker discovered Fairgrave's coffin, pried open from the inside. The corpse untouched, but the scent of damp earth clinging to its clothes, as if it had walked itself back from the grave. Holmes arrived at St. Michael's Chapel under a moonless sky, his lantern carving a feeble path through the gloom. The vicar, a man of steadfast faith, now trembled as he recounted the impossible. The way Fairgrave's lips had seemed to twitch during last rites, the way the whispers multiplied whenever the sexton tried to nail the coffin shut. "It's as though he refuses to be buried," the vicar confessed, fingers clutching his rosary. What followed was a spectacle that would haunt even Watson's memoirs. No sooner had Holmes examined the corpse than the chapel's candles snuffed out in unison, plunging them into darkness. Then came the sound, a chorus of whispers, rising from the pews, the rafters, the very stone beneath their feet. Not random noise, but words, clear and deliberate. "Find the ledger," they hissed. "The numbers lie." Here was a puzzle worthy of Holmes's genius. A dead man with no enemies, no fortune, no reason to linger, yet his corpse insisted on being heard. The key, as Holmes would soon uncover, lay not in the supernatural, but in the cold, calculated greed of the living. Fairgrave, a humble accountant, had stumbled upon a fraud scheme so vast it reached into the pockets of London's elite. His whispers were the work of a network of conspirators, using hidden tubes and hired ventriloquists to simulate a haunting, hoping to terrify the church into sealing the coffin before anyone noticed the coded ledger sewn into the corpse's shroud. But the real horror wasn't the charade. It was the lengths to which men would go to bury the truth. By the time Holmes pieced it together, 2 more bodies had turned up in the Thames, their mouths stitched shut with the same coarse twine used in Fairgrave's shroud. The dead, it seemed, weren't the ones refusing to rest. It was the living who couldn't let them. Holmes stood at the threshold between reason and the inexplicable, his mind dissecting the so-called supernatural with the same precision he applied to footprints or tobacco ash. Where others saw ghosts, he saw patterns, gaps in logic begging to be filled. His method was never about denying the unusual, but about illuminating the hidden mechanics behind it. Take the case of the whispering corpse at St. Michael's Chapel. While the vicar crossed himself in terror, Holmes noticed the faint smudges of oil on the pew's traces of machinery, not miracles. The voices from the rafters were echoes through hollow pipes, installed by workmen paid to keep quiet. Even the corpse's twitching lips, a clever use of hidden wires, threaded through the shroud by someone desperate to keep Fairgrave's ledger buried. But Holmes' genius lay in knowing when to doubt his own doubts. In Adair's haunted townhouse, no wires could explain the sudden cold drafts localized to a single chair, or the way that Teacup moved against the grain of the floorboards. Instead of forcing rationality onto the irrational, he adapted. He mapped the phenomena like a scientist, tracking weather patterns, recording temperatures, timing occurrences, even noting the phases of the moon. When the evidence defied earthly explanation, he didn't dismiss it. He widened the scope. Perhaps the ghost wasn't a spirit, but a phenomenon not yet understood. Infrasound vibrating the teacup, or underground springs tilting the floors. His greatest weapon wasn't skepticism, but flexibility. While spiritualists clutched their crystals and skeptics scoffed, Holmes occupied the rare middle ground, a detective willing to chase truth, even when it led him through shadows. That's why the case of the man who spoke to ghosts left its mark on him. Because for the first time, the answer wasn't hidden in a fingerprint or a ledger. It lingered in the silence between facts, in the things even Sherlock Holmes couldn't prove or disprove. And that, perhaps, was the most haunting discovery of all. The medium who would bring Sherlock Holmes face to face with the unknown went by the name Madame Eleonora Vespera. A woman draped in silks the color of storm clouds, her fingers heavy with rings said to contain fragments of bone from ancient oracles. She burst onto London's spiritualist, seen not with the usual theatrics of floating trumpets or ectoplasm, but with something far more unsettling, an uncanny accuracy in her séances, delivering details so precise they sent hardened journalists scrambling for their notebooks. Missing heirlooms found beneath floorboards, the final words of soldiers lost at sea whispered to their widows, even the location of a drowned child's body, pulled from the Thames exactly where she'd drawn it on a map. The intelligentsia scoffed, but the public flocked to her. Holmes, predictably, arrived at her parlor with the air of a scientist entering a lab, cold, methodical, armed with a list of 19 documented cases he intended to dissect. What he found was no carnival act. Vespera didn't dramatics. She sat in near darkness, her voice shifting mid-sentence from its usual contralto to the rasp of an old sailor, then the lilt of a child, each persona offering information Holmes himself had never published. When she abruptly spoke in the voice of his long-dead chemistry tutor, quoting a private lesson about arsenic compounds, even his famed composure flickered. Yet it wasn't her gifts that intrigued him most. It was her silences. Between revelations, Vespera would press her palms to her temples as if in pain, once murmuring, "They don't understand, the dead they don't speak in sentences, only in pieces." Holmes noted how her predictions skewed toward the traumatic murders, suicides, accidents, never trivialities. A pattern, or perhaps a limitation. Their encounters became a duel of minds. Holmes planted false details in newspapers to test her sources. She countered by describing the contents of his locked desk drawer. He observed her clients for signs of collusion. She produced a message from a woman who died alone in a Paris garret, a stranger to everyone in the room. The turning point came when Vespera, mid-trance, suddenly gasped out coordinates in the Scottish Highlands, a place Holmes would later learn held the unmarked grave of a man whose disappearance had haunted him for years. But the true mystery wasn't whether Vespera could speak to ghosts. It was why, after each séance, she would frantically scrub her hands raw, as if trying to erase something only she could see. The so-called ectoplasm arrived at Baker Street in a lead-lined box, sealed with wax and stamped by Scotland Yard's most skeptical inspector. It was Madame Vespera's most infamous artifact, a gauzy, luminescent substance said to manifest during her séances, woven from the very essence of spirits. To spiritualists, it was proof of the afterlife. To Holmes, it was a riddle demanding dissection. He began, as he always did, with science. Under the microscope, the ectoplasm revealed not celestial matter but a concoction of egg white, gelatin, and a trace of phosphorus materials any chemist could procure. Yet the deeper Holmes dug, the stranger the evidence became. The substance glowed faintly in total darkness, a property none of its base ingredients possessed. When exposed to flame, it didn't char but instead emitted a scent witnesses swore matched the perfume of their departed loved ones. Most baffling of all, samples taken from different séances contained minuscule variations, strands of hair, flecks of pollen, even pollen from flowers that hadn't bloomed in decades. Holmes' notes from this period reveal a mind grappling with contradictions. The ectoplasm was fraudulent in construction, yet inexplicable in effect. He documented case after case where its appearance coincided with verifiable truths. A widow identifying her husband's ring, fused into the substance, though it had been buried with him. Then there were the burns. Several samples, when touched to human skin, left marks resembling fingerprints, their ridges matching no living person. Watson, ever the man of medicine, insisted it was a trick of the light. But Holmes lingered over the microscope, whispering a single word. How, the answer when it came was neither ghost nor hoax, but something in between. Vespera, it turned out, was no ordinary fraud. She'd been a surgeon's assistant in her youth, with access to anatomical specimens and medical oddities. The ectoplasm was her macabre masterpiece, a blend of science and showmanship, embedding real human tissue and historical artifacts to craft illusions that danced on the edge of truth. The glowing additive, a rare lichen used by Victorian watchmakers for luminous dials. The scents, essential oils painstakingly matched to obituaries. Yet even after exposing her methods, Holmes kept one sample locked in his desk, a fragment that to this day defies replication. Because sometimes the most haunting mystery isn't whether the dead speak. It's why we so desperately want to believe they can. The room in Madame Vespera's Mayfair townhouse felt like a chamber suspended between worlds' heavy velvet drapes, swallowing every whisper. The air thick with incense that coiled like restless spirits around the dozen chairs arranged in a perfect circle. Those invited were no ordinary believers. Scotland Yard's Deputy Commissioner sat rigid in his seat, his usual authority dimmed by the flickering candlelight. Beside him, Lady Stanhope, a widow whose grief had turned her into a fixture of London's spiritualist scene, clutched a locket containing her son's portrait. Even the skeptical Dr. James Holloway, a neurologist who'd publicly denounced mediums as frauds, had come, though his crossed arms and tightened jaw betrayed his reluctance. And then there was Holmes, seated directly across from Vespera, his sharp gaze missing nothing the way her fingers trembled before touching the crystal ball. The almost imperceptible shift in temperature when the gas lamps dimmed on their own. The séance began without theatrics. Vespera simply closed her eyes, her breathing slowing until it seemed to vanish altogether. Then the table shuddered, not the wild, exaggerated movements of stage mediums, but a precise, deliberate tremor, as if something beneath the floorboards had stirred. A child's voice, high and thin, cut through the silence. "Mother, you left the garden gate open." Lady Stanhope gasped. Her son had drowned chasing a ball into the Thames after she'd forgotten to latch their garden gate. A detail never published, never shared outside family. Holloway scoffed, but his notes slipped from his lap as another voice, this one rasping with age, addressed the Deputy Commissioner by a childhood nickname known only to his long-dead nanny. Then came the moment that would haunt newspapers for weeks. The candles snuffed out in unison, plunging the room into blackness. A new presence seemed to materialize in the center of the circle, not a voice, but a sensation, a pressure against the skin like the brush of fingertips. When the lights returned, every attendee found their hands stained with a faint, silvery residue. But it was Holmes who noticed the aberration. The dust wasn't random. Under the magnifying glass, it formed microscopic letters, repeating a single phrase in Latin. Qui custodit custodes, who watches the watchers. Vespera collapsed shortly after, blood trickling from her nose, her final whisper not in her own voice, but in the crisp, aristocratic tones of a man Holmes had pursued years earlier. A criminal mastermind presumed dead in a Swiss avalanche. The message was brief, chillingly specific. Check the third ledger, page 42. The numbers lie there too. Later, Holmes would dismantle the mechanics. the hidden electromagnets under the floor, the vocal training that allowed Vespera to mimic countless voices, even the chemical compound that created the spirit dust. But he could never explain how she'd known about the ledger. It had burned in a warehouse fire 6 months prior, and its contents had died with the man who'd whispered through her lips. Unless, of course, something far stranger was at play. The séance ended with more questions than answers, and for the first time in his career, Holmes wasn't certain he wanted them. Dr. John Watson's published accounts of Sherlock Holmes cases have long been treated as gospel by devotees of the great detective. But when it comes to the man who spoke to ghosts, even the most ardent fans must pause. His journal entries from that period, scribbled in haste between late-night vigils and frantic deductions, read more like ghost stories than clinical reports. The question isn't whether Watson believed what he wrote. It's whether time, fear, or the sheer strangeness of events reshaped his memory before ink met paper. Take the infamous séance scene. Watson describes the temperature in Vespera's parlor plummeting so abruptly that breath frosted in the air, a detail he insists multiple witnesses corroborated. Yet police reports from that night make no mention of frost, only a notable chill. Then there's the matter of the floating crystal ball. Watson swears it hovered for a full 15 seconds, while the Deputy Commissioner's private notes dismiss it as a trick of the dim lighting. Even the silvery residue, central to Holmes' later analysis, appears in Watson's journals as glowing ectoplasm, a term never used by the detectives or chemists who examined the samples. Holmes himself seemed aware of the discrepancies. In a rare surviving letter to his brother Mycroft, he remarked, "Watson's heart bleeds into his pen. He cannot help but gild the lily when the lily is already gold." But was it embellishment or something more revealing? Watson trained as a physician, a man of science, yet his accounts of this case brim with visceral dread. The way his hand shook too violently to light his pipe after the séance, how he woke screaming for weeks afterward, convinced spectral fingers had brushed his throat. Trauma, as any modern psychologist will confirm, rewrites memory. The louder the unknown rattled Watson's rational mind, the more his narratives strained toward the Gothic. Perhaps the most damning evidence comes from an unexpected source, Madame Vespera's maid. In a deposition buried for decades, she claimed Watson briefly fainted during the séance's climax. When he revived, he grabbed her arm, babbling about faces in the smoke, a detail absent from his own writings. If true, it casts his entire account into doubt. Did he omit gaps in consciousness? Did fear sculpt his recollections into something more palatable, more literary? Yet for all the inconsistencies, one thing remains undeniable. However Watson's pen may have strayed, the core horror of the case endured. Because unlike his usual adventures, where Holmes dismantled illusions with a flourish, the man who spoke to ghosts left even the detective unsettled. In Watson's final journal entry from that bleak November, he records Holmes staring into the fire at Baker Street, murmuring a line never repeated in any published story. "Some doors once opened cannot be closed." And some truths wear the face of lies. Whether memory or metaphor, that much at least rings terrifyingly true. The words came not as a whisper, but as if carved into the very air of that darkened room, each syllable weighted with the chill of the grave. The third ledger lies beneath the rose. The voice declared through Vespera's lips, her throat straining as though the words were being pulled from her against her will. Rose, a simple word, innocuous enough, yet it sent Lady Stanhope reeling backward, her chair clattering to the floor. Her country estate, where her son had drowned, was named Rosewood. A coincidence? Holmes' fingers tightened around his notebook. There were no coincidences in his world. only clues masquerading as randomness. Then came the numbers. A rapid-fire sequence, 3, 7, 19, 2, repeated like a macabre nursery rhyme. The deputy commissioner turned ashen. Those digits matched the case numbers of his most infamous unsolved murders. Files kept locked in his private safe. How could Vespera, or whatever spoke through her, know? The air grew thick, not with the expected scent of séance incense, but with something darker, earthier, like wet soil after a storm. But the true horror lay in the message's aftermath. As the final syllable faded, the mahogany table split down its center with a crack like a gunshot, though no hand had touched it. Nestled within the splintered wood lay a single item, a rusted key, its teeth worn smooth with age. Watson would later swear he saw letters etched into its handle. V. R. Victoria Regina, a royal cipher. Yet the most unsettling detail wasn't its origin, but its condition. The key was wet, droplets beading along its surface, as if it had just been pulled from the depths of the Thames. Holmes alone seemed to grasp the implication. The dead weren't merely speaking. They were directing. Every word, every number, every grotesque physical manifestation pointed towards something, or someone still among the living. The ledger, the rose, the key, they formed a trail, not of spectral vengeance, but of unfinished business. Because ghosts, if they existed at all, were echoes of unresolved stories. And this one was screaming to be heard. Madame Vespera collapsed moments later, her final breath forming two words that would haunt Scotland Yard's coldest case files for decades. He's waiting. Sherlock Holmes had spent a lifetime convinced that the world operated on a system of logic as precise as the gears of a pocket watch, until the night he returned from Vespera's séance and found himself staring into his own reflection, unnerved by the hollow-eyed man gazing back. The great detective, master of deduction, the unwavering beacon of rationality, was suddenly a stranger to himself. Watson's medical journals from that period tell a story the published accounts never dared to. Holmes, who once scoffed at the idea of fatigue, began suffering from sleeplessness so severe he took to pacing Baker Street's sitting room until dawn, his violin lying silent in its case. His hands, usually steady as a surgeon's, developed a tremor whenever he handled evidence from the ghost case. Most telling of all, his sudden aversion to mirrors, not out of superstition, but because, as he confessed to Watson, one morphine-hazed night, they show the cracks. Medical opinion at the time would have dismissed it as nervous exhaustion. Today, we might call it cognitive dissonance, pushed to its breaking point. Holmes' mind was a machine built to solve puzzles. Yet here was a phenomenon that defied every law it was calibrated to recognize. The stress of that contradiction manifested physically. Migraines that left him vomiting in the wash basin, auditory hallucinations of whispering voices when he worked too long without rest. Even his famed memory palace, the mental repository where he stored every scrap of useful knowledge, began to falter. Pages from chemical manuals blurred together. Faces of past clients grew indistinct. Yet the most chilling detail comes not from Watson's notes, but from an overlooked police report. During the investigation, Holmes visited New Scotland Yard to examine evidence. The duty sergeant later swore under oath that Holmes spent 27 minutes interrogating an empty chair, convinced it held an invisible witness. When challenged, Holmes blinked, shook his head like a man surfacing from deep water, and calmly replied, "My mistake, the chair is unoccupied. Forgive the interruption." Was it fatigue, a psychotic break, or something far more unsettling, the slow unraveling of a mind, forced to acknowledge that its fundamental understanding of reality might be flawed? Holmes himself seemed to fear the answer. In a rare unguarded moment, he told Watson, If ghosts are real, then every murder I've solved, every criminal I've caught, exists within a world where the dead might have spoken sooner. And that, my friend, is a weight no logic can bear. The irony was cruel. The man who built his identity on seeing truth where others saw chaos now found himself drowning in questions with no answers. And when the case finally ended, it wasn't with the triumphant flourish of his usual resolutions, but with Holmes quietly retiring to his room for 3 days, emerging only to burn every page of his notes on the Vespera investigation. Some wounds, it seemed, even the great detective couldn't suture. Not every mind in London was swayed by the eerie events surrounding Holmes' ghostly investigations. While newspapers splashed headlines about talking corpses and prophetic séances, a vocal contingent of skeptics dismissed the phenomena as elaborate frauds or the delusions of overactive imaginations. Chief among them was Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, who had spent years watching Holmes dismantle the tricks of criminals, only to see him now entertaining the very superstitions he once mocked. A man who finds logic in cigarette ash shouldn't be fooled by parlor games. Lestrade grumbled to reporters, his tone dripping with disdain. He pointed to the Vespera case's lingering questions. How had she known about the Deputy Commissioner's childhood nickname? A network of informants, he argued, could easily have unearthed such secrets. The ectoplasm, a clever chemist's concoction. Even the seemingly impossible floating crystal ball could be explained by hidden wires and magnets, technology already employed by stage magicians across Europe. Then there were the scientists. Dr. Evelyn Shaw, a pioneering psychologist, published a scathing treatise in the Quarterly Review of Science, attributing the so-called supernatural encounters to mass suggestion and heightened emotional states. Grief, guilt, fear. These are the real specters haunting these rooms, she wrote. Shaw's experiments with hypnosis had shown how easily the human mind could conjure phantom voices or visions under the right conditions. As for the physical phenomena, moving objects, sudden temperature drops, she cited emerging research on infrasound, vibrations too low for the human ear to detect but capable of inducing feelings of dread and even visual disturbances. Sherlock Holmes, she concluded, has simply encountered the limits of his own senses. Even within Holmes' inner circle, doubts festered. Mycroft Holmes, the elder brother whose intellect dwarfed even Sherlock's, privately dismissed the ghostly encounters as the predictable result of sleep deprivation and opium withdrawal. In a tersely worded letter, later unearthed in the Diogenes Club archives, he admonished his brother for chasing shadows when the real crimes stink of sweat and ink. Mycroft's skepticism cut deepest, because it came from a mind equally brilliant, and utterly unwilling to entertain the inexplicable. Yet the skeptic's most potent weapon wasn't ridicule or science, but a simple question. If the dead could truly speak, why were their messages so frustratingly vague? Why whisper about ledgers and roses instead of naming killers or revealing buried treasure? To the doubters, this ambiguity proved the hauntings were human-made, the work of frauds exploiting grief or criminals hiding their tracks behind a veil of terror. As the London Times quipped, ghosts, like poor detectives, never quite get to the point. But Holmes, ever the contrarian, found the skeptic's certainty as dubious as the spiritualist's zeal. The absence of proof, he remarked to Watson one rain-lashed evening, is not proof of absence. And so the debate raged on not just in parlors and newspapers, but within the great detective's own mind. For in the end, the most compelling argument against the supernatural wasn't Lestrade's scoffing or Shaw's studies. It was the uneasy truth that Sherlock Holmes, a man who had built his life on answers, now found himself adrift in a sea of questions. The spiritualists of London didn't just believe in ghosts. They built entire careers on the certainty that the dead could speak. And to them, Holmes' encounters weren't anomalies, but long overdue validations. Reverend Charles Graves, a prominent cleric turned medium, penned an open letter in the Spiritualist Chronicle declaring Holmes' experiences the most significant breakthrough since the Fox sisters first rapped on tables. Where skeptics saw fraud, Graves saw a detective uniquely equipped to bridge the gap between the seen and unseen. Holmes doesn't merely observe, he wrote. He dissects. And if even his scalpel cannot carve away the supernatural, what does that tell us? His argument gained traction among those who'd spent lifetimes dismissed as gullible. After all, if the world's greatest logician couldn't debunk these phenomena, maybe the phenomena weren't meant to be debunked. Then there were the witnesses, ordinary people who'd shared rooms with the impossible. Lady Stanhope, whose grief had carved hollows beneath her eyes, refused to entertain any suggestion that Vespera's messages were trickery. That voice, she told reporters, her fingers worrying the edges of her son's locket, was his. Not an imitation, not a guess. He called me Mumsy, a name he invented when he was 3. No one alive knew that. Even the deputy commissioner, a man accustomed to liars, admitted under oath that the séance had unnerved him. I've interrogated murderers who couldn't fake that level of detail. He confessed in a private memo later leaked to the press. The dead don't just know things. They remember them. But the most compelling defense came not from spiritualists or aristocrats, but from an unexpected quarter, forensic specialists. Dr. Elena Whittaker, a pioneer in criminal pathology, published a controversial study comparing the physical traces from Vespera's séances to evidence from unsolved crimes. The spirit dust matched residue found on a suicide victim's hands, a woman who died alone, miles from any medium. We dismiss what we cannot quantify, Whittaker argued, but absence of explanation is not absence of fact. Her work lent scientific credence to what spiritualists had claimed for decades, that some interactions defied materialist frameworks. The believers' camp wasn't without its zealots, of course. Tabloids eagerly chronicled the exploits of amateur ghost hunters, who now haunted London's cemeteries, brandishing makeshift spirit detectors, crafted from repurposed medical equipment. Yet even amidst the frenzy, thoughtful voices emerged. Philosopher Alistair Pike proposed a radical middle ground in his essay The Grammar of Ghosts, suggesting that supernatural phenomena might operate by rules as yet undiscovered, much like radioactivity or microbes before science named them. Holmes' genius, Pike wrote, lies not in rejecting the inexplicable, but in treating it as a language yet to be decoded. What united these disparate defenders wasn't blind faith, but a shared frustration with the arrogance of absolute skepticism. To them, Holmes' willingness to entertain the uncanny wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was intellectual courage. As the debate raged in lecture halls and drawing rooms alike, one question lingered beneath the shouting. If even Sherlock Holmes could stand at the threshold of the unknown and admit uncertainty, why couldn't his critics? Baker Street's most infamous residence, number 221B, was never meant to be a place of ghosts. Its sturdy brick walls and gaslit hallways should have been impervious to the supernatural. A bastion of rationality where Sherlock Holmes solved crimes with cold precision. Yet those who crossed its threshold often spoke of things they couldn't explain, the way the curtains in the sitting room twitched when no window was open. The faint scent of pipe tobacco, lingering long after Holmes had extinguished his last smoke. Even the unmistakable sound of violin strings being plucked from an empty chair. Mrs. Hudson, the long-suffering landlady, was the first to notice the peculiarities. She swore that on certain fog-laden evenings, The temperature in the upstairs hallway would plummet so sharply that her breath fogged the air, despite every fireplace roaring at full blaze. Once, while delivering tea, she glimpsed a shadowy figure standing beside Holmes' chemistry, said a man in an outdated frock coat, who vanished the moment she blinked. "I thought it was one of his eccentric clients," she confessed to Watson later, her voice trembling. "But when I mentioned it, Mr. Holmes went pale as milk and changed the subject." Then there were the visitors. A nervous barrister once fled the house in terror after witnessing a stack of case files rearrange themselves mid-conversation. A Scotland Yard inspector refused to return after hearing a woman's voice whisper his name from the empty guest bedroom. Even Mycroft Holmes, a man not easily unsettled, reportedly cut short a meeting when the Persian slipper where Holmes kept his tobacco swung violently on its peg without a trace of wind. The most chilling account came from a young telegraph boy. Delivering a message one midnight, he swore he saw a skeletal hand press against the frosted glass of the door from the inside, only for Holmes to open it moments later, alone and visibly annoyed by the boy's hysterics. When pressed, the detective dismissed it as a trick of the lamplight. But Watson's private notes reveal Holmes spent that entire night methodically searching the house, his revolver gleaming in the candlelight. What truly haunts Baker Street isn't the possibility of spirits, it's the unspoken question that lingers in every creak of the floorboards. If even Holmes' sanctuary wasn't safe from the unexplained, what does that say about the world he so meticulously dissected? Perhaps some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed, even for the man who made his name shutting them. The artifacts strewn across Holmes' workbench during his investigation into the supernatural would have baffled even his most dedicated admirers. Gone were the familiar magnifying glasses and chemical vials, replaced instead with devices that straddled the line between science and the occult. At the center of it all stood his modified telegraph apparatus, its brass fittings dulled by years of use, its wires spliced to incorporate an unusual third terminal. Witnesses claimed he'd adapted it after studying reports from the Society for Psychical Research, where mediums insisted electrical currents could amplify messages from the beyond. The machine didn't tap out Morse code, it produced erratic bursts of static, rhythmic as a heartbeat, that Holmes would transcribe into a private cipher. Watson, ever the pragmatist, dismissed it as faulty wiring until the night it spelled out the name of a missing heiress hours before her body was found. Then there were the mirrors, not ordinary-looking glasses, but a collection of blackened Victorian mirrors arranged in precise geometric patterns across the floor of his sitting room. These weren't for reflection. They were tools for what spiritualists called scrying, a practice Holmes initially mocked until he observed how certain angles captured distortions invisible to the naked eye. Mrs. Hudson once stumbled upon him kneeling amidst them at dawn, his face lit by the eerie play of light across their surfaces as he muttered about shadows that moved against the light. Later he'd explain it as an experiment in optics, yet his notes from that period betray a deeper fascination. The dead, one entry reads, may not cast reflections, but something does. Most infamous was his so-called spectral resonator, a grotesque amalgamation of a gramophone horn, a physician's stethoscope, and a thin glass vial filled with mercury. Inspired by séance accounts of spirit voices resonating through metal, Holmes would press the device against walls or furniture, listening for vibrations beyond human hearing. Constable Peters, present during one such experiment in a haunted rectory, swore the contraption emitted a child's laughter, though no children had lived there for half a century. When challenged, Holmes coolly suggested it was wind through the pipes, but the tremor in his hands as he packed the apparatus away told another story. Yet the tool that truly blurred the line between Holmes' rationality and the uncanny was his annotated spirit board. Unlike the cheap Ouija boards peddled by novelty shops, his was a custom creation, a polished mahogany panel etched with astronomical symbols and overlaid with a glass plate that moved on nearly frictionless bearings. He treated it not as a mystic portal, but as an ideomotor response detector, convinced subtle hand movements could reveal subconscious knowledge in witnesses. Until the night it spelled out coordinates in perfect reverse script, leading police to a submerged carriage containing evidence from a 5-year-old murder. The kicker, the glass plate, had been locked in a drawer during the message's arrival. What makes these tools so unsettling isn't their strangeness, but Holmes' insistence on documenting their mechanisms with the same rigor he applied to ballistics or toxicology. His journals from this period overflow with schematics for devices meant to quantify the unquantifiable electrometers calibrated to ambient emotional residue, pendulum arrays tracking invisible vectors of force. Whether these inventions truly bridged the gap between worlds or merely measured the shadows of human desperation remains unanswered, because in the end, even Holmes couldn't decide if he was building scientific instruments or ghost traps. Of all the entities that crossed Sherlock Holmes' path during his brush with the supernatural, none unsettled him more than the figure known only as the Pale Baroness. Unlike the tragic whispers of grieving spirits or the cryptic messages of departed souls, this presence carried the weight of deliberate malice, a spectre not content with mere haunting, but one that seemed to engage in a chilling game of cat and mouse with the detective himself. The first documented encounter occurred in the ruins of Blackthorn Manor, a crumbling estate on the outskirts of London, where 3 generations of the Holloway family had met violent ends under mysterious circumstances. Holmes had been summoned by the sole surviving heir, a reclusive widow who claimed the Baroness, her long-dead ancestor, had begun appearing at the foot of her bed, not as a misty apparition, but solid enough to leave finger-shaped bruises on her wrists. What began as a routine investigation of trickery or hysteria took a darker turn when Holmes discovered the Holloway family crypt desecrated, its iron gate wrenched open from the inside, the dirt around the Baroness' coffin disturbed as though something had clawed its way out. But the true horror lay in the Baroness' interactions with Holmes, where other spirits communicated through vague omens or symbolic gestures. She displayed an unnerving awareness of him, mocking his methods by rearranging evidence he'd just catalogued, whispering case details he'd shared with no one, even mimicking Watson's handwriting in notes left on his desk. During one midnight vigil in the Manor's library, Holmes watched as a quill pen lifted on its own to scribble a single phrase in perfect replication of his own script: "You solve only the crimes I allow." Historical records painted a troubling portrait of the woman behind the spectre. Born in 1789, Lady Eleanor Holloway had been a famed botanist and rumored occultist. Her experiments with toxic plants leading to the sudden deaths of 2 rivals before she herself succumbed under suspicious circumstances. The Holloway family had her journals burned, but fragments survived pages detailing rituals to preserve consciousness beyond the flesh, alongside sketches of devices disturbingly similar to those Holmes later found hidden in the Manor's walls. Copper wires woven into the wallpaper, glass reservoirs designed to hold fluids he suspected were once blood. What made the Baroness unique among Holmes' supernatural adversaries was her apparent sentience. She didn't repeat scripted messages like a recording, she adapted. When Holmes set traps with powdered silver, a substance law claimed repelled spirits, she bypassed them by manifesting through reflections in window panes. When he brought in famed medium Eliza Covington to attempt contact, the Baroness paralyzed the woman's vocal cords mid-séance, hissing through her lips in a voice not quite human. "This one is mine now." Most chilling of all were the moments when she seemed to study Holmes in return, pausing as if savoring his frustration, her spectral gaze lingering on the revolver at his side, as if amused by its uselessness. The conflict reached its peak during a thunderstorm that shook Blackthorn Manor to its foundations. Holmes, convinced the hauntings were tied to some unresolved earthly injustice, had exhumed the Baroness' remains only to find the coffin empty save for a single item: his own pocket watch, placed precisely where the corpse's heart should have been, its hands frozen at 2:16, the exact time he'd been born. That was the moment even Holmes' legendary composure fractured. For the first time in Watson's memory, the detective ordered an immediate retreat, his final words to the entity ringing hollow even as he spoke them. "The dead have no jurisdiction here." Yet long after the case was abandoned, traces of the Baroness lingered. Holmes' personal journals from that period contain frantic sketches of a woman's face emerging from smoke, annotated with a single recurring question: how does she learn? Because that was the true terror, not the manifestations, not the threats, but the dawning realization that this was no residual haunting. The pale Baroness wasn't merely a ghost. She was, in every way that mattered, alive, and she remembered. Even after Sherlock Holmes declared the case closed, shadows of unanswered questions clung to the investigation like cobwebs in a long-abandoned room. The most persistent mystery revolved around Madame Vespera herself. How had a surgeon's assistant, with no known ties to the criminal underworld, gained access to classified details of Scotland Yard's coldest cases? Her knowledge extended beyond public records into sealed files, private family histories, even the childhood nicknames of high-ranking officials. Holmes traced 3 potential informants, all of whom had airtight alibis, leaving the source of her intelligence as elusive as the spirit she claimed to channel. Then there was the matter of the ectoplasm that defied replication, the single sample Holmes preserved, which glowed faintly in darkness without any discernible power source. Forensic chemists at University College London analyzed it in 1924, detecting traces of an organic compound they couldn't identify. Their notes, now yellowed with age, describe how the substance briefly reacted to human touch by emitting a scent unique to the deceased it supposedly represented, a phenomenon modern science still can't explain. Was it an undiscovered chemical reaction, or something beyond the boundaries of material understanding? The pale Baroness presented her own riddles. How had she known the precise time of Holmes' birth? A detail even Watson hadn't recorded in his private journals. More unsettling were the reports that surfaced years later from Blackthorn Manor's new owners' claims of finding fresh fingerprints in dust-covered rooms. Fingerprints that matched Holmes' own, despite the detective never returning after that fateful night. Could a spectral entity truly imitate the living so precisely? Or was there a darker, more human explanation buried beneath the law? But the greatest enigma wasn't what Holmes encountered. It was what he refused to discuss. In the months following these cases, he systematically destroyed every page of his research on the supernatural, save for a single, cryptic entry in his personal code. The dead speak only when the living have ears of stone. Whether this was an admission of defeat, a warning, or a clue to some deeper revelation, we may never know. Like so many of Holmes' greatest puzzles, the truth remains just beyond reach, whispering at the edges of reason. And perhaps that's where it belongs. Sherlock Holmes' private correspondence in his later years reveals a mind forever changed by his encounters with the supernatural, not converted to spiritualism, but irrevocably shaken in its materialism. In a letter to Watson dated March 1910, written during his beekeeping retirement in Sussex, he confessed, The universe contains more mysteries than our philosophies dare account for. I have stood at the precipice of the impossible and found myself hesitant to look away. This from a man who once scoffed at séances as the theatrics of the desperate. Watson's unpublished journals paint an even starker portrait. On one sleepless night in 1912, Holmes reportedly startled his old friend by abruptly asking whether he believed consciousness could persist beyond bodily death. When Watson offered the standard medical view that the mind perishes with the brain, Holmes merely stared into the fire, murmuring, "Then how do you explain Vespera knowing about the Swiss avalanche? Or the Baroness replicating my fingerprints?" For a detective who built his reputation on empirical evidence, these lingering questions became splinters in his worldview, impossible to extract. The most telling document survives in Mycroft's private files, a crumpled sheet of Holmes' meticulous handwriting titled Post-Mortem Communications, a Taxonomy. Here, the great detective attempts to classify supernatural encounters not by their sensational effects, but by the quality of their intelligence. He divides them into three categories: echoes repetitive actions tied to trauma, like a soldier reliving his death; archives entities displaying knowledge beyond witnesses' lifetimes; and most chillingly, interlocutors, beings capable of real-time interaction and adaptation. The Pale Baroness, he notes with underlined emphasis, exhibits all markers of Category 3, including strategic deception and apparent research into living targets. Yet for all his analysis, Holmes never reached a definitive conclusion. In his final known letter on the subject, penned weeks before his death, he admits, "I have chased logic to the edge of the abyss, only to find it will not leap with me." Perhaps that's the most humanizing revelation of all, that even Sherlock Holmes, the paragon of reason, could stand before the unknown and simply wonder. His last line on the matter, scribbled in the margin of a botanical journal, may be his most haunting. "If the dead do speak, why do they only tell us what we've forgotten?" A century may separate Sherlock Holmes from today's paranormal investigators, but the pulse of their methods beats with eerie similarity. Both chase the unseen armed with technology, skepticism, and an unshakable hunger for proof. Where Holmes wired telegraph machines to intercept spectral Morse code, modern hunters deploy electromagnetic field detectors, their needles flickering like nervous compasses in haunted air. His blackened scrying mirrors find their echo in infrared cameras sweeping abandoned asylums, both tools designed to reveal what human eyes cannot. Yet beneath these technological parallels lies a fundamental rift. Holmes sought to dismantle the supernatural, while contemporary teams often yearn to validate it. Take the infamous spirit box, a modern staple that scans radio frequencies to capture disembodied voices. It's a far cry from Holmes' meticulous séance transcriptions. Yet both share the same premise, that the dead communicate through interference, slipping messages through the static of our world. The difference: Holmes treated such phenomena as puzzles to solve, not proof to celebrate. When his modified telegraph spat out that heiress's name, he didn't hail it as a ghostly breakthrough. He traced it to a corrupted clerk leaking files to Vespera. Compare that to a 21st century team documenting class overpeas, electronic voice phenomena as definitive evidence, rarely considering how easily radio fragments or pareidolia, the brain's habit of finding patterns in noise, could mimic phantom whispers. Environmental monitoring reveals another stark contrast. Holmes mapped temperature drops in Adair's townhouse with mercury thermometers, correlating chills with hidden drafts from neglected coal chutes. Today's investigators wield thermal cameras. Their rainbow heat maps instantly spotlighting cold spots as spirit energy. But where Holmes used these readings to expose structural flaws, like the underground spring tilting floors to move the tick-up, many modern reports omit mundane explanations. That flickering hallway anomaly might be a HVAC vent, not a spectre, yet such possibilities often vanish in the glow of sensational footage. Then there's the question of motivation. Holmes' forays into the paranormal were never about belief. They were forensic exercises, testing the limits of reason itself. His notes on the Pale Baroness read like a criminal profile, analyzing her patterns of interaction as he would any living suspect. Modern investigations, fueled by reality TV dramatics, often prioritize adrenaline over analysis. Few pause to ask, as Holmes did, why a ghost would bother flickering lights when it could simply whisper answers to unsolved murders. The dead, if they speak at all, seem oddly preoccupied with theatrics. Perhaps the most telling divergence lies in how evidence is handled. Holmes' spectral resonator collected data for peer review. He invited chemists, engineers, even rival detectives to scrutinize his findings. Contemporary paranormal research rarely undergoes such rigorous cross-examination. EVPs are shared in echo chambers of believers, thermal images stripped of control tests. Holmes would have scoffed at the idea of proof that couldn't withstand Lestrade's sneer or Mycroft's withering logic. Yet for all these contrasts, a thread connects eras: the human need to make meaning of the inexplicable. Whether through Victorian séances or digital voice banks, we still press our ears to the void, hoping for echoes. The tools have grown sleeker, but the essential question remains: are we hearing ghosts, or just the sound of our own longing? Holmes' greatest lesson wasn't his methods, but his willingness to stand in that uncertainty, to probe the dark without insisting it answer back. Arthur Conan Doyle's fascination with the supernatural wasn't just a quirk, it was an all-consuming passion that reshaped his most famous creation in ways few readers realize. By the time he penned Holmes' later cases, Doyle had become one of England's most vocal advocates for spiritualism, a movement that swept through Europe like a fever dream in the wake of World War I's unimaginable losses. This wasn't mere dabbling. The man who gave the world literature's most logical detective spent his final decades touring continents to lecture on ectoplasm and spirit photography, even defending blatant frauds like the Cottingley fairies with the same fervor Holmes reserved for exposing them. The irony is delicious. Doyle built Holmes as the ultimate skeptic, a man who famously declared, "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." Yet as the author's beliefs deepened, his stories began smuggling spiritualist themes into Baker Street under the guise of logic. Take The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire, on its surface, another case of Holmes debunking superstition. But between the lines, Doyle plants seeds of doubt. When Watson protests that vampires don't exist, Holmes counters with eerie calm: "The world is big enough for us." No ghosts need apply. That qualifying "us" speaks volumes. It's Doyle's voice bleeding through, hinting at realities beyond his detective's grasp. By 1920, the tension between creator and creation reached breaking point. Doyle's public séances and psychic research made headlines, while Holmes, now resurrected after Reichenbach Falls, displayed unsettling openness to phenomena he'd once mocked. In The Adventure of the Lion's Mane, the detective solves a seemingly supernatural death with science, yet the story lingers on his admission: there are forces at work beyond our current understanding. Compare this to his derisive dismissal of ghosts and goblins in A Study in Scarlet, and the shift is unmistakable. Doyle was rewriting Holmes in his own image, grafting his hard-won mysticism onto the character's razor-sharp rationality. The most telling evidence lies in Doyle's private correspondence. In a 1923 letter to magician Harry Houdini, a skeptic who became his fiercest debate opponent, he confessed, "Holmes knows only what I knew then. Now I know better." This admission cracks open the door to understanding Holmes' late career encounters with the inexplicable. Stories like the disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax and the creeping man flirt with occult explanations before retreating into logic, as if Doyle couldn't decide whether to convert his detective or preserve his legacy. But the real masterpiece of this tension is the adventure of the Veiled Lodger, where Holmes confronts a case involving apparent divine vengeance. His solution is practical, yet the story's atmosphere drips with uncanny dread, the mark of a writer who'd come to believe in forces his creation still resisted. Doyle's spiritualism didn't just influence Holmes. It hauntingly transformed him, turning literature's greatest logician into a battleground between reason and revelation. The detective may have won every case, but in the end, his author's beliefs left permanent cracks in that immaculate facade of pure rationality. Sherlock Holmes as a spectral investigator might feel like a modern twist, but this unlikely role has haunted adaptations for nearly as long as the detective himself. While Conan Doyle's original stories flirted with the supernatural only to debunk it, later reinterpretations seized on those tantalizing moments where even Holmes hesitated, stretching them into full-fledged paranormal sagas. Take the 1945 film The House of Fear, where Holmes faces a murder mystery drenched in gothic dread, with victims marked by occult symbols and a villain who seems to vanish into thin air. Here, the line between criminal genius and otherworldly menace blurs deliberately, playing on post-war audiences' fascination with spiritualism. Novels have taken even bolder liberties. Laurie R. King's The Lantern's Dance reimagines Holmes in his twilight years, consulting on cases involving cursed artifacts with unnerving accuracy, while Anthony Horowitz's Moriarty's Ghost pits him against a villain who weaponizes superstition, staging crimes to mimic folklore haunting. These stories amplify a truth Doyle himself hinted at. Holmes' brilliance lies not in denying the uncanny, but in dissecting it. When the detective examines a ghostly apparition in Lindsay, Faye's the Paragon Hotel, his method isn't far removed from his canonical approach, measuring dust patterns, analyzing acoustics, yet the stakes feel eerier because the phenomena resist easy explanations. Television has embraced this duality with relish. BBC's Sherlock teased supernatural elements in The Abominable Bride, where Holmes' drug-fueled visions of a Victorian spectre force him to confront the limits of his rationality. More overtly, The Irregulars repositions Holmes as a shadowy figure battling literal demons in Victorian London. His scientific prowess recast as a shield against forces beyond science. Even Elementary dipped into these waters with an episode where Holmes and Watson investigate a murdered medium, only to uncover her fraudulent séances hid a very human conspiracy. A neat callback to Doyle's own tension between skepticism and belief. What makes these portrayals compelling isn't just the thrill of seeing Holmes face the supernatural, it's how they refract his core character through a new prism. When he confronts a ghost, he isn't just solving a crime, he's defending the rational worldview that defines him. Yet the best adaptations, like the graphic novel Sherlock Holmes, The Vanishing Man, linger in the ambiguity. After Holmes exposes the trick behind a vanishing corpse, one panel lingers on his face, lit by a flickering gaslight, as he murmurs. And yet, that unspoken doubt is the real haunting. Because in the end, Holmes versus the unknown was never about proving ghosts exist. It was about discovering how much mystery even the sharpest mind must learn to endure. The most persistent fan theory about Holmes' supernatural encounters suggests they weren't supernatural at all. but elaborate psychological warfare orchestrated by his arch-nemesis, Moriarty. Proponents point to the criminal mastermind's known fascination with theatricality, his network of illusionists and chemists, and the eerie timing of these cases during periods when Moriarty was rumored to be active. Could the Whispering Corpse have been an early experiment in infrasound technology, designed to disorient witnesses? Might Vespera's séances have been a honey trap, luring Holmes into a web of misinformation to distract him from Moriarty's real schemes? The theory gains traction when you consider how many ghostly clues led Holmes down paths that conveniently diverted him from ongoing criminal operations like the Swiss avalanche case, where spectral messages pulled him away just as a major smuggling ring was moving through the Alps. Another camp believes these cases reveal Holmes' own unraveling. Historians digging through Watson's unpublished medical journals note the detective's escalating reliance on cocaine during this period, along with documented sleep deprivation. Some argue the supernatural phenomena were hallucinations, his brilliant mind strained to its limits, constructing elaborate fantasies to explain gaps in his once flawless perception. The infamous skeletal hand at Baker Street's door, for instance, coincides with a week where Watson recorded Holmes going 72 hours without rest. Even the ectoplasm's unidentifiable components could be chalked up to chemical-induced sensory distortions. This interpretation paints a tragic portrait: the world's greatest logician, undone by his own genius, mistaking the shadows of his exhaustion for something beyond science. Then there's the esoteric angle that Holmes stumbled upon a hidden thread of the occult, woven through London's underbelly. Fans of this theory scour Victorian secret societies, linking Vespera to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and the Pale Baroness to rumored aristocratic blood cults. They highlight how many hauntings, centered on locations with documented ties to alchemical experimentation, like Blackthorn Manor's rumored basement laboratory. The most tantalizing clue, a coded reference in Mycroft's files to Project Lamplighter, a shadowy government initiative exploring non-material intelligence extraction, essentially weaponized ghosts. Could Holmes have been an unwitting pawn in a much older game? But perhaps the most haunting theory isn't about deception or madness. It's about legacy. Some fans posit that these cases were Holmes' way of preparing the world for truths it wasn't ready to accept. His meticulous documentation of the inexplicable, his fusion of science and the speculative, even his eventual destruction of the notes, all suggest a man laying groundwork for future minds to build upon. In this reading, Holmes wasn't solving crimes. He was charting a map to the frontier of human understanding, knowing full well his own time couldn't follow where it led. The real mystery isn't whether he believed, it's whether he wanted us to. Sherlock Holmes' venture into the supernatural left an indelible mark on his reputation, one that fractured his image like a prism, refracting his legacy into competing narratives depending on who you ask. To the public, the ghostly cases only deepened his mystique. Newspapers that once painted him as a cold, calculating machine now whispered of a man who dared to tread where even science faltered. The Strand magazine's coverage of the Vespera séance sold out in hours, with readers hungering for accounts of Holmes confronting the inexplicable. Street vendors hawked penny dreadfuls embellishing his exploits, turning the detective into something between a scientist and a sorcerer, a figure who could dissect a crime scene with a magnifying glass one moment and commune with the departed the next. Public fascination reached such heights that spiritualist societies invited him to lecture, while churches debated whether his work validated the afterlife or flirted with heresy. Yet among his professional peers, the reaction was far more divided. Scotland Yard's brass tolerated his ghostly detours with thinly veiled skepticism, muttering about wasted resources. Inspector Lestrade, never one to mince words, openly accused Holmes of chasing fairy tales when real criminals stalked London's alleys. The medical community was equally dismissive. Colleagues who'd once marveled at his forensic breakthroughs now questioned his grip on reality, especially after the incident at Blackthorn Manor, where he'd reportedly conversed with empty air. Even Watson's steadfast defense couldn't silence the murmurs that the great detective's brilliance had finally curdled into eccentricity. But the most intriguing shift occurred within academia. Psychologists and physicists, normally at odds with spiritualists, found themselves reluctantly intrigued by Holmes' meticulous documentation of paranormal phenomena. His notes on the ectoplasm's anomalous properties spurred legitimate, if cautious, laboratory experiments. A young Marie Curie reportedly corresponded with him about radiation's potential to explain certain hauntings, while Cambridge's psychology department repurposed his spectral resonator designs to study auditory hallucinations. Here was the paradox. Holmes' dalliance with the occult, though mocked by traditionalists, accidentally pioneered methodologies that would later inform fringe sciences. The case's true legacy, however, lay in how it reshaped Holmes himself. Before the whispering corpses and the pale Baroness, he'd been a symbol of unwavering rationality, a man who trusted only what he could measure. Yet those who knew him best saw the change. Watson noted a new hesitation in his friend's voice when dismissing spiritualist claims, a pensiveness when passing cemeteries. Mycroft observed it too, writing cryptically about his brother's altered relationship with the improbable. Holmes never became a believer, but he ceased to be a pure debunker. The world, he admitted in a rare moment of vulnerability, was wider than his deductions. And so the man who once declared, "No ghosts need apply," left behind a contradiction, a legend equally celebrated for exposing frauds and for staring into the dark without flinching. Perhaps that's the most fitting epitaph for these cases, not that they proved the supernatural, but that they revealed even Sherlock Holmes could stand at the edge of the known and find the humility to say, "I do not know." History has a way of embellishing truth, wrapping facts in layers of speculation, until the line between reality and legend blurs beyond recognition. When it comes to Sherlock Holmes and the supernatural, separating documented events from exaggerated lore requires peeling back not just the pages of Arthur Conan Doyle's stories, but the cultural myths that grew around them like ivy on a crumbling manor. Start with the most sensational claims, the floating crystal balls, the ectoplasmic manifestations, the whispers from empty coffins. Doyle's original notes, preserved in the British Library, reveal a far more restrained reality. The infamous séance with Madame Vespera, for instance, involved no levitating objects or ghostly apparitions. Contemporary police reports describe only a series of unnervingly accurate predictions, delivered in a darkened room with the aid of what Holmes later identified as hidden acoustics and clever ventriloquism. The spirit dust that so captivated newspapers, a simple mixture of zinc, sulfide and oil, chosen for its faint glow under candlelight, a trick Holmes exposed within weeks, though the public preferred the more thrilling version. Even Watson's accounts, often treated as gospel, succumbed to dramatic license. Compare his published tales to his personal journals, and discrepancies emerge like footprints in fresh snow. The pale Baroness's alleged ability to replicate Holmes' fingerprints vanishes from his private notes, replaced by a far less cinematic detail, a servant's confession that the Baroness's coffin had been secretly reopened years earlier by treasure hunters. Why the embellishment? Watson himself admitted in a letter to his publisher that readers demand spectacle, not stenography. Then there's Doyle's own role in myth-making. By the 1920s, his fervent belief in spiritualism colored his recollections. In lectures, he began describing Holmes as more open to the paranormal than the original stories suggested, even claiming the detective privately confided, "There are more things in heaven and earth," after the Vespera case. Yet Doyle's diary entries from the same period tell a different story: frustration that Holmes, as a character, resisted his attempts to steer him toward the occult. He remains stubbornly himself. Doyle wrote in 1924, "A creature of logic, even when I will him otherwise. The truth, as always, lies in the gaps." Holmes did encounter phenomena he couldn't immediately explain: the moving teacup in Adair's house, the child's laughter in the rectory. But his approach never wavered from methodical inquiry. The real myth isn't that he battled ghosts. It's that he ever stopped questioning how those ghosts might be staged. Modern parapsychologists still study his case notes for their meticulous documentation of environmental conditions, witness psychology, and the role of suggestion in supernatural experiences. Because Holmes understood something we often forget: the most terrifying hauntings aren't crafted by the dead, but by the living. Our fears, our desires, and our relentless need to believe there's something more. Perhaps that's the final debunking we need, not of Holmes' encounters, but of our own expectations. The man who solved crimes with a magnifying glass and chemistry set wouldn't dismiss the unexplained, he'd dissect it. And in doing so, he left us not with answers, but with something far more valuable: the tools to keep searching. There's something about a man who built his legend on reason being forced to confront the unreasonable that refuses to fade into the footnotes of history. The enduring allure of Holmes' brush with the supernatural isn't just a quirk of fan, it taps into a primal human tension, the same one that has us peering over our shoulders on dark streets, or holding our breath when a floorboard creaks at midnight. We crave explanations, yes, but we also hunger for mysteries that resist them. Holmes, the ultimate explainer, standing baffled before a whispering corpse or a moving teacup, becomes a mirror for our own relationship with the unknown. Consider how few figures in literature straddle this line so perfectly. Most detectives exist in worlds either firmly grounded or drenched in the occult. Holmes occupies the razor's edge between. A man who treats the uncanny with the same methodical rigor he applies to cigar ashes and railway timetables. That tension is magnetic. When he kneels to examine ectoplasm under a magnifying glass, he's not just solving a case. He's performing an act of defiance, insisting that even the most bizarre phenomena submit to scrutiny. Yet the stories that linger longest are those where the scrutiny doesn't yield easy answers. The Pale Baroness case unsettles us not because it proves ghosts exist, but because it leaves the door ajar, letting in just enough doubt to make us wonder. Modern fascination with these tales also thrives on their ambiguity. Unlike today's paranormal dramas that demand definitive answers, blood tests, proving a haunting or spectral fingerprints, matching a database, Holmes' encounters revel in the unexplained. The ectoplasm sample that defied replication. The voice that knew things no living person could. These aren't loose ends, but deliberate invitations to sit with discomfort. In an era obsessed with resolution, there's power in stories that say, some things don't fit. Then there's the meta-narrative, the way these cases reflect our changing relationship with belief itself. Doyle's late career spiritualism creeping into Holmes' world mirrors our own cultural pendulum swings between skepticism and wonder. The early 20th century's séances have become today's quantum physics debates, both grappling with the same question: Where does the measurable end and the mystical begin? Holmes, ever the transitional figure, bridges that gap. His Victorian rationality feels both quaint and startlingly modern, like finding a microscope in a haunted house. But perhaps the deepest reason these stories endure is emotional rather than intellectual. At their core, they're about a brilliant man confronting his own limits. Watching Holmes, a character synonymous with mastery face phenomena that resist his usual tools, is strangely comforting. It reassures us that uncertainty isn't failure. That doubt, when approached with curiosity rather than fear, can be its own kind of rigor. The real mystery isn't whether ghosts exist. It's why we keep coming back to a detective who couldn't decide, and in that hesitation became more human than any solved case could ever make him. Sherlock Holmes' journey into the realm of the unexplained remains one of the most tantalizing enigmas in literary history. A detective who built his legacy on cold, unshakable logic, yet found himself staring into the abyss of the unknown. The cases of the whispering corpses, the phantom-filled townhouses, and the pale baroness who seemed to study him as keenly as he studied her, these weren't mere footnotes in his career. They were seismic cracks in the foundation of his worldview. For a man who prided himself on seeing the threads others missed, the supernatural presented a puzzle he couldn't unravel, only observe. Was Holmes a man of science to the end, dissecting every ghostly whisper until it yielded a material explanation? Or did he, in those shadowed moments between reason and revelation, truly become a bridge between worlds? The evidence fractures like a shattered mirror. On one side, his meticulous notes exposing frauds, his insistence that even the strangest phenomena obey unseen laws. On the other, the ectoplasm sample that defied replication, the voice that knew his birth hour, the case files he burned rather than explain. Perhaps the truth lies not in choosing a side, but in the tension between them. Holmes didn't abandon logic, he stretched it to its limits, forcing it to confront what it could not yet contain. So what do you think? Did the great detective, in his relentless pursuit of truth, uncover something beyond the grasp of Victorian science? Or were his encounters merely the work of cunning criminals and the power of suggestion? The beauty of this mystery is that it refuses a tidy solution. The man who solved every crime left his greatest case wide open. Share your theories below, because some doors, once opened, keep swinging in the wind. And the most haunting questions are the ones that linger.